Her mother's voice cut across the kitchen like a blade. "Rowan, get out of sight. Company's coming. Real company. And I don't need you scaring them off." 26 years old, standing in her own home, covered in mud from a 4-hour fence repair, and her mother was hiding her like a broken chair shoved into a back room. Rowan didn't argue. She never argued. She just wiped her hands on her work pants and stepped toward the hallway. That was the moment Silas Blackridge walked through the front door. He didn't look at Adelaide, who was already smoothing her hair and smiling. He didn't look at the parlor dressed up with the good curtains. He looked straight down the hallway, straight at Rowan, and he stopped walking. If you've ever been invisible your whole life and someone suddenly saw you, you know exactly what happened next. And if you haven't, stay with me, because this story will show you what that looks like, what it costs, and what it changes forever. Whoa. If this kind of story speaks to you, the ones about people who were overlooked and then became impossible to ignore, subscribe to this channel and hit that bell. Drop your city and country in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. And don't forget to like. It tells me to keep going. The storm had come in from the northwest 2 nights before anyone expected it. That was the thing about weather on the frontier. It didn't consult your plans. It didn't care that the Mercer family had 2 ranch hands out sick, or that the fences on the eastern pasture had needed attention for 3 weeks, or that Ruth Mercer had already told her husband Gerald that they couldn't afford another lost calf this season. The storm came anyway, heavy and fast, dragging ice and mud with it, and when Rowan heard the first calf bawling from the far end of the pasture at 2 in the morning, she didn't wake anyone else up. She pulled on her boots in the dark. She told herself it was because there was no point. Her father wouldn't go. He'd stopped going out in bad weather 2 years ago when his knee gave out, and even before that, he mostly pointed and directed rather than moved himself. Her sister Adelaide was 17 then and had never once offered, and her mother, Ruth, would have stood at the door in her nightgown, told Rowan to be careful, and gone back to bed before Rowan had cleared the porch steps. So Rowan went alone, in the sleet, with a lantern that kept threatening to go out. She found the calf half submerged in a drainage ditch that had flooded faster than anyone expected. The mother was there, frantic and useless the way cattle sometimes get when fear overrides everything else, circling without helping. The calf was small, too small, born early, born into the wrong month, and it had wedged itself against the fence line trying to get out and only gotten itself in deeper. Rowan went in after it. The water came up past her knees. She lost a boot briefly and had to feel around for it with her foot without letting go of the fence post she was gripping. The calf was heavier than it looked, dead weight with cold and panic, and when she finally got her arms under it and hauled, the mud fought her like it wanted to keep something. It took 40 minutes. She counted later when she was back in the barn, not because it felt like 40 minutes, it felt like 4 hours, but because she wanted to know. She dried the calf with burlap sacking and got its temperature up and sat with it until she was sure it would hold through till morning. She didn't tell anyone what she'd done. Not because she wanted credit she was afraid she wouldn't get. She'd moved past that kind of hoping a long time ago. She just didn't see the point. Her mother would have scolded her for getting her boots wet. Her father would have nodded and asked whether she'd checked on the other 2 heifers while she was out there. Adelaide wouldn't have asked at all. So Rowan hung her wet clothes by the stove before dawn, changed into dry ones, and made the coffee. That was a Tuesday. Silas Blackridge arrived on a Thursday. Rowan heard his name before she heard anything else, which was typical of the way information traveled in a house where she didn't quite belong to the conversation. She was in the side yard splitting wood when she caught the words through the open kitchen window. Her mother's voice pitched high in a way it only went when she was performing for someone important. Blackridge. The name landed in Rowan's chest with a different weight than most names did. Everyone in 3 counties knew Silas Blackridge, not because he was loud about it. That was the interesting thing. He wasn't the kind of man who announced himself. He was maybe 40, maybe a few years past, with the kind of face that had been weathered into something that looked more like rock than skin. He ran the largest ranch operation between the Cowboy River and the Southern Ridge, employed 14 men full-time, and had a reputation for paying his debts and keeping his word that most men spent their whole lives trying to build and never quite managed. He'd lost his wife 4 years ago. People mentioned it differently depending on who was telling the story. Some said fever, some said complications after a fall, Some said just that she'd been sick a long time. What they all agreed on was that he hadn't remarried, hadn't seemed interested in remarrying, and had raised his daughter Clara himself with the kind of quiet steadiness that made older women in town press their hands to their hearts when they talked about it. Rowan didn't know why he was at the Mercer house. She had a guess, though. She had a terrible, sinking guess that she tried to push down while she kept splitting wood. Adelaide had turned 21 in September. She was what people around here called a catch, which meant she was pretty in the obvious way, soft-spoken when she wanted to be, and had never once been photographed in muddy work clothes. Their mother had been quietly campaigning for a good match all year, and the name Blackridge had come up in low voices in the kitchen more than once. Rowan split another log, stacked it. When her mother appeared at the side door 15 minutes later, Rowan already knew what the face meant. It was the face that meant there is an audience inside and you are not part of it. "Go get cleaned up," Ruth said, which sounded like an invitation, but wasn't. "But don't come through the parlor. Use the back stairs." "What's going on?" "We have a guest." Her mother's eyes did a quick, involuntary sweep of Rowan's clothes, the worn canvas jacket, the scuffed boots, the hair she'd pushed up under an old hat. The sweep lasted half a second and said everything. "Mr. Blackridge?" Her mother's chin came up. "Yes, and I need you to—" "I'll stay out of the way." Ruth paused. Something crossed her face, not guilt exactly, more like relief mixed with a tiny thread of something she wouldn't have named if you'd asked her. "Good," she said. "Thank you." Rowan watched her go back inside. She stood there a moment in the cold with the axe still in her hand. Then she set it down, pulled off her work gloves, and walked around to the far side of the barn, where she could sit on the old fence rail and be invisible. She was very good at being invisible. 26 years of practice. She stayed out there until the cold got serious about it, which in late October could happen faster than you'd think. She wasn't sulking. She told herself that firmly and honestly believed it. There was a difference between sulking and just understanding how a situation worked. Her mother wasn't cruel in the way people talked about cruelty. She was just practical in a way that had calcified over time, and Rowan had long since figured out how she fit into the practical arrangement of the Mercer household. Adelaide was the future. Rowan was the present, the one who made the present run so the future could happen. She was thinking about whether the sorrel mare's leg wrap needed changing when the barn door opened behind her. She turned around expecting her father. She turned around expecting anyone except the man who was actually standing there. Silas Blackridge was taller than she'd realized. She'd seen him twice before, both times at a distance. Once at the county auction 3 years ago, once passing on the main road in a wagon. Up close, the weathered quality she'd noticed from far away made more sense. It wasn't just age. It was the kind of face built by actual weather, actual work, the kind that couldn't be faked. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately read. Not surprise, exactly. More like someone who'd found what they were looking for and was now taking a moment to confirm it. "You're Rowan," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. She didn't get off the fence rail. She wasn't sure why. Maybe because she didn't want to scramble, didn't want to look like she was trying to adjust herself for him. "I'm sorry, did you need something from the barn? I was looking for you." She stared at him. "I came to the house," he said, "and your mother told me you were—" He stopped. A brief pause that she would think about later, turning it over. "She said you were occupied, so I walked around." Rowan got off the fence rail. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but something in the straightness of how he was standing, the directness of how he looked at her. The same way you'd look at someone you intended to talk to, not someone you'd stumbled into accidentally, told her this was not a casual detour. "Mr. Blackridge," she said, "I think there may be some confusion. If you came to see Adelaide—" "I didn't." 2 words, clean, no apology in them, no embellishment. "I came to see you." She didn't believe him. That was the honest thing. Her first thought was that her mother had sent him out here as some kind of errand, maybe to ask Rowan to bring something in, maybe to get her out of the cold on behalf of some performance of family warmth that Ruth wanted to put on. Her second thought was that he'd come to the wrong person for something. Information about the eastern pasture, something about a property line, something practical. Her third thought, which she stamped down hard the moment it surfaced, was something she wasn't ready to look at yet. "What can I do for you?" she asked. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. He looked at her for a moment in the way that would come to be the most recognizable thing about him. That unhurried, undivided attention that made most people slightly uncomfortable because they weren't used to anyone actually listening rather than just waiting. "I'll be direct," he said. "I've been thinking about remarrying. I have a daughter who needs more than I'm able to give her on my own. I have a ranch that needs a partner with real skill, not someone decorating a chair. I've spent the better part of 6 months trying to determine who in this county might fit that, and I want to talk to you about whether you'd be willing to consider it." The wind came around the side of the barn and went between them. Rowan said nothing for a long moment. "You don't know me," she finally said. "I know more than you think." "What does that mean?" He didn't rush it. That patience of his, it would drive her half crazy before she understood it was actually real and not some practiced performance. "2 months ago," he said, "I was riding the fence line on the south side of my property. The storm came in fast. I ended up sheltering on the Mercer side of the ridge until it moved through." He paused. "I saw you in that drainage ditch with the calf." Something moved through Rowan's chest. She wasn't sure what to call it. "I watched for nearly half an hour," he said. "You didn't know I was there. Nobody was watching. You weren't doing it for any reason except that the calf needed doing. You went in the water in the dark without hesitating. You didn't give up when it took longer than it should have. And when you got that animal out," he stopped. "You sat with it. You sat there in the cold until you were sure it was going to be all right." Rowan's jaw was tight. She didn't know why the telling of it made her feel exposed in a way the actual doing of it never had. That's just ranching," she said. "That's just what you do." "It is," he agreed. "It's exactly what you do. Not everyone does it." She told him she needed to think. She thought later that he might have expected her to say yes immediately. Most women in her position might have. A comfortable life, a respected name, a way out of a household where she'd been managed into a corner for most of her adult years. The practical calculus wasn't complicated, but Rowan had spent 26 years in a situation where other people made the decisions and she lived with the results. And she had learned one thing above everything else. The moment you accept terms without asking what they are is the moment you sign yourself over. "I have questions," she said. Something shifted in his expression. It might have been relief. She would wonder about that later. "Ask them. If I came to Blackridge, and I'm not saying yes, what would that actually mean? Because there's a difference between a wife and a partner, Mr. Blackridge, and I'm not interested in the first thing." He didn't flinch. "What would partner mean to you?" "It means my name on the deeds. Both of them, whatever you're holding. It means I'm in the room when decisions get made. Real decisions, not just which curtains to hang. It means the men on your ranch take direction from me the same way they take it from you. And if they don't, we deal with that together rather than you smoothing it over and sending me back to the house." She watched his face while she said it. He wasn't performing patience. He was actually listening, and she could tell the difference because his expression changed in small ways as she spoke, like he was genuinely taking inventory. "And your daughter," Rowan continued. "I'm not walking in to replace her mother. I don't know her. She doesn't know me. That takes time." "It does," he said. "I agree with you. So you're not asking me to, but I'm asking you to be honest with her the way you're being honest with me right now." He paused. "Clara is 10. She's smart, and she's been through something hard. She doesn't need someone performing softness at her. She needs something real." Rowan looked at him for a long moment. "Why me?" she asked. It came out quieter than she intended. "I told you. You told me about the calf. That's one night. That's one moment. You don't know what I'm like when it's not a dramatic moment. You don't know what I'm like to live with or argue with or—" "No," he said, "I don't. That's why I'm here asking instead of assuming." He held her gaze. "I'm not offering you a favor, Miss Mercer. I'm proposing a partnership that I think would serve us both well, and I'm asking if you're willing to find out." The cold was really getting at her now. She was aware that her mother was probably watching from a window, that this conversation had already lasted long enough to mean something, that her entire household was probably rearranging itself around the fact of his continued presence on the property. "I'll give you an answer in the morning," she said. He nodded once. "That's fair?" He started back toward the house, then stopped. "For what it's worth," he said, without turning around, I didn't come to see Adelaide because I knew which one of you had kept this ranch running for the last 3 years. That's not the woman you hide in the back of the house." Then he walked away. Rowan stood by the barn fence in the cold for a long time after he was gone. What? The house that night was a particular kind of loud that Rowan had learned over the years to recognize. The loud that happened when her mother was angry and performing calm at the same time. Ruth Mercer moved through the kitchen with very controlled, very deliberate movements, setting things down with just slightly more force than necessary. Adelaide sat at the table looking confused and oddly wounded, which she had a right to, since nobody had entirely explained what was happening. Gerald Mercer was in his chair by the window, the way he always was when something uncomfortable was developing, positioned so he could claim later that he hadn't been part of it. Rowan came in through the back, changed her boots, and was reaching for the stovepot when her mother's voice came at her like a flat stone skipping across still water. "He asked for you." It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. "I know," Rowan said. "I told him you were... I thought he was here for Adelaide. I think he made clear what he was here for." Her mother turned. The controlled expression had a crack in it now, something underneath that was harder to name. "What did you say to him, out there?" "He asked questions. I asked questions back." Adelaide made a small sound. "He didn't even..." She stopped, swallowed. "He sat in the parlor for 20 minutes. Mama brought out the good plates. He was perfectly polite, and then he said he needed a moment and walked out to the barn." Rowan looked at her sister. Adelaide was pretty, genuinely pretty, not in the way people said to be kind, and she'd never been unkind to Rowan, not exactly. She just existed in a separate category, in a glass case kind of way that their mother had built around her over many years. The hurt on her face right now was real, and Rowan felt it, and also felt the complicated, uncomfortable awareness that she couldn't fix both things at once. "He came to see me," Rowan said, as gently as she could manage. "I didn't arrange that." "But why?" Adelaide asked. "He doesn't even... When did he even meet you?" "He didn't. Not formally." She didn't explain further. The story of the drainage ditch felt like something she needed to keep for a while longer. Her mother set down a pot with a sharp clank. "You'll refuse him." It came out flat. Not a request, not exactly a command, more like a fact she was installing into the room. Rowan looked at her. "Why?" "Because it's not..." Ruth stopped. The crack widened just slightly. "It's not appropriate. Adelaide isn't who he asked." "Rowan," her father's voice from the chair by the window. Everyone looked at him. He had the uncomfortable look of a man who had discovered, belatedly, that the quiet room he'd been sitting in was actually a fire. "Now that's enough." "I haven't said anything yet, Papa." "You're saying plenty." He shifted in the chair. His knee was bothering him. She could tell from the way he held himself. "Mr. Blackridge is a serious man, and this is a serious situation, and I think we all need to approach it carefully." Carefully meaning we don't go accepting offers without talking it through as a family. Rowan set down her own cup, deliberately, carefully, because the thing she felt right now needed to be held in check for a few more hours. "It's my answer to give," she said, "not the family's." The silence that followed was not the comfortable kind. Her father looked at the window. Her mother looked at the pot. Adelaide looked at her hands. Rowan went to bed early and lay in the dark with her eyes open, listening to the wind work at the roof, thinking about drainage ditches and cold water, and a man who'd stood in the dark watching without announcing himself, and what it meant that he'd seen the thing she'd never once thought to tell anyone about. She thought about what partnership meant, what her name on a deed meant, what it would feel like to work at something that counted her. By the time the house settled into quiet, she already knew what she was going to say in the morning. She just needed the night to be sure she was saying it for the right reasons. She said yes before breakfast. Not in a dramatic way. No announcement, no gathering of the household. She came downstairs at first light, found Silas already at the front of the property talking to his horse and checking the cinch on his saddle. And she walked out to him in her work jacket with her hair still loose, and she said, "I'll accept, under the terms we discussed." He turned around. "All of them?" "All of them. My name on the deeds, a voice in every major decision. The men take direction from me the same as from you." "Agreed." "And we tell Clara the truth, that this is new for everyone. That she doesn't have to call me anything she's not ready to call me. He looked at her for a moment in the early gray light, and something in his face shifted in a way she was starting to recognize. Not softness, exactly, but a kind of settling, like a door fitting properly into its frame. Agreed, he said again. Then yes, Rowan said. I'll marry you. There was no embrace, no tears. She hadn't expected either, and was quietly glad they didn't happen. They shook hands, actually shook hands, which she thought later was perhaps the most honest thing that had happened to her in years. And then Silas said he'd send the paperwork through his lawyer by end of week, and Rowan said that was fine, and she went back inside to make the coffee. She told her mother at the table. Ruth Mercer set down her cup. She looked at the cup. She looked at the window. She looked at Rowan with an expression that cycled through several things in about 4 seconds. Disbelief, calculation, something that was almost anger, and then the careful, deliberate neutral of a woman who had decided to reserve judgment until she could figure out how this affected her. He agreed to your conditions, Ruth said. Yes. All of them. Yes. Her mother picked her cup back up. Well, she said, and that was all she said for a long time. Gerald Mercer took the news differently. He came into the kitchen 20 minutes later, and when Ruth told him, he stood in the middle of the room with his hands at his sides and the complicated look of a man processing something that moved faster than he was comfortable with. Blackridge agreed to put her name on the property. Apparently, Ruth said. Gerald looked at Rowan. There was something in his look, not pride, she wasn't going to call it that because it wasn't quite that, but something adjacent to respect that she hadn't seen directed at her before. It made her feel strange, a little like being handed something she'd asked for so many times she'd stopped expecting it. Well, he said, same as her mother, and then he sat down. Adelaide didn't come downstairs until nearly 9. When she heard, she went very quiet in the way she went quiet when she was genuinely hurt rather than performing it. Then she looked at Rowan across the kitchen table and said, Are you happy about it? It was the most direct question Adelaide had ever asked her. I think so, Rowan said. Ask me in 6 months. Adelaide almost smiled. Yeah, she said softly. Okay. That was the last easy conversation Rowan had for a while. The town found out within 48 hours, which was about 46 hours faster than Rowan had hoped for, but exactly as fast as she'd expected. Hadley Creek was not a large town. It had a post office, a general store, 2 churches, a doctor who was also the barber when things were slow, and approximately 300 people who had known each other long enough that the arrival of genuinely new information was treated like a natural event, something to be observed, discussed, and interpreted from every possible angle until all available meaning had been extracted. Silas Blackridge remarrying was news enough on its own. Silas Blackridge choosing Rowan Mercer was something else entirely. She heard the first version of it at Calloway's general store 3 days after she'd given her answer, when she went in for lamp oil and found Margaret Voss and her daughter-in-law Dina already deep in a conversation that stalled noticeably when Rowan pushed through the door. Margaret recovered fast. She was practiced at it, and smiled the kind of smile that was technically a smile. Rowan, we were just talking about you. I assumed, Rowan said. She went to the oil shelf. Well, it's wonderful news, Margaret said, in the voice she used for things she didn't think were wonderful. Silas is a good man. It's just... A pause that lasted slightly too long. Unexpected. Most things worth doing are, Rowan said. Dina made a sound that might have been a smothered laugh. Margaret's smile thinned. Your sister must be... Margaret paused again, choosing. Adelaide is fine, Rowan said. She set the oil on the counter and looked at Hector Calloway, who was pretending to organize something behind the register. Just the oil today, Hector. She paid and left. Outside, the cold air was a relief. She stood for a moment on the board sidewalk, lamp oil in hand, and let herself feel the particular, specific irritation of being talked about in terms of someone else's expectations. She'd lived with it for 26 years, and she still hadn't built up a full immunity to it. Maybe you didn't. Maybe that was the honest answer. Down the street, near the feed merchants, she could see 2 men she recognized, Darrow Peel and his brother-in-law, whose name she could never remember, talking with the particular body language of men who found something genuinely funny. She couldn't hear what they were saying. She didn't need to. She'd grown up in a small town. She knew the posture. She walked to her horse, tied the oil to the saddlebag, and rode home. The wedding was small, which was Rowan's idea and Silas's relief. 10 people, the judge from Sutter Creek who rode out on a Thursday, and a cold morning in early November that couldn't decide whether it wanted to rain. Her mother wore her good dress and held herself together with the rigid dignity of a woman, navigating an occasion that had not gone to plan, but who had decided at the last possible moment to participate in it with something like grace. Gerald Mercer shook Silas's hand twice, and both times seemed like he was trying to think of something appropriate to say and failing to locate it. Adelaide stood beside Rowan in a coat she'd borrowed and was the only person who cried, which she seemed surprised by herself. Rowan wore her nicest blouse, not a dress, which her mother had feelings about, which Rowan acknowledged and then set aside, and stood beside Silas in front of the judge and said the words with full attention, which was the only way she knew how to say anything important. Silas said his words looking at her, not at some middle distance above her head. She noticed that. Afterward, there was food and thin, uncomfortable conversation, and then everyone went home, and Rowan helped Silas load the last of what she was bringing into the wagon. 3 boxes of her own books, her good saddle, her tools, and a quilt her grandmother had made that was the only thing in the Mercer house she'd ever felt was truly hers. Her mother stood at the porch while the wagon loaded. At the last moment, before Rowan climbed up, Ruth came down the steps. She moved like she had something to say and wasn't entirely sure she'd formed it yet. "Be careful," she said finally. It landed somewhere between an instruction and something softer. "I'm always careful," Rowan said. "No." Her mother looked at her, and for a moment something was in the look that hadn't been there in a long time. "You're always capable. That's different. Be careful too." Rowan stood with that for a second, then she nodded. "Okay." She climbed up. Silas flicked the reins. The wagon moved. She didn't look back, which wasn't because she didn't feel anything. It was because she had a long habit of looking at where she was going rather than where she'd been, and it had served her well enough so far. Black Ridge Ranch was larger than she'd pictured, though she'd pictured it fairly large. The main house had 2 full stories and a covered porch that ran the length of the front. Real lumber, not the patched and repatched board she'd grown up with. The barn was the largest she'd ever seen up close, built to hold 20 horses with room for equipment and feed, and 2 haylofts that could run through a hard winter without restocking. There were 6 outbuildings she could count from the wagon, and the pasture land ran north until it hit the ridge in a way that made you understand, physically and immediately, how much operation a man was running when you said the name Black Ridge. She cataloged all of it as they came up the road. Not in an impressed way. She didn't have the luxury of being purely impressed. There was too much to assess. But the way you catalog anything you're now responsible for. 2 of the ranch hands were visible when they pulled in, both of them pausing in what they were doing to look. Not subtle about it. The look wasn't unfriendly exactly, but it was the particular look of men who had formed an opinion before meeting someone and were now doing the work of deciding whether to revise it. Silas introduced her simply. "This is Rowan. She'll be working the ranch with me. You take direction from her the same as from me." He said it like it was the most unremarkable thing in the world, which she would understand later was a specific and deliberate choice. The less ceremony you put around a thing, the harder it was to treat it as extraordinary. The older of the 2 men, weathered, mid-50s, with a mustache that had its own opinions about things, looked at Rowan for a moment. His name was Decker, she'd learned. Decker had been on Black Ridge Ranch for 11 years. "Ma'am," he said, a single word that kept most of itself in reserve. "Decker," Silas said, "can you see to the wagon?" "Yes, sir." They went inside. Clara was at the kitchen table. Rowan had thought about this moment more than she'd thought about most of the other moments. More than the wedding, more than the signing of the papers, more even than her conversation with Silas in the barn. A 10-year-old girl who had lost her mother and now had a stranger arriving in her house was a situation that did not resolve itself cleanly, and Rowan hadn't tried to prepare any particular approach because she didn't trust prepared approaches with children. Clara looked up from whatever she was writing. She was small for 10, wiry, dark-eyed, with the kind of self-possession that showed up in children who'd been around adults during serious times. She looked at Rowan in a way that was almost startlingly direct. "You're Rowan," Claire said. "I am." "Papa said you fixed a fence line by yourself last spring when it took out 50 yards in the flooding." Rowan glanced at Silas, who was very carefully not smiling. "He said that?" "He also said you can deliver a calf in the dark." "I've done it a few times." Clara looked at her with the exhaustive appraisal of a child who had not yet learned to pretend she wasn't doing it. Then she went back to her writing. "Okay," she said. It wasn't warmth. It wasn't acceptance. It was something more specific than either. It was a child filing information away for later. Rowan understood it completely. She'd been that child once. In some ways, she still was. "Okay," Rowan said, and went to look at the stove. The trouble started on the fourth day. She'd expected it sooner, honestly. 4 days of a new woman arriving on a well-established ranch, making assessments, asking to see the books, walking the fence lines on her own with a notebook. 4 days was actually patient by the standards of men who had something to protect. It came from a hand named Garrett. He was 28 or so, strong, the kind of man who'd always been the most competent in whatever room he was in and had organized his entire identity around that. He'd been at Blackridge 2 years, long enough to feel ownership over how things were done. She was in the south barn reviewing the feed records when he came in. "Those are management records," he said. "I know." She didn't look up. Silas asked me to review the supply ledgers this week." She turned a page. The numbers in the feed costs were off, not dramatically but consistently, in the way that happened when someone was estimating rather than tracking. "Who's been keeping these?" A pause. "I have. Last 8 months." She looked up then. Garrett had the expression of a man who was being very polite about something he didn't think called for politeness. "You're finding something wrong with them?" "I'm finding they're estimated. The hay costs from September don't match the Callaway invoices I found in the desk. Off by about $12 a month." Silence. "That's not—" He stopped. "It adds up over 8 months," she said. Not accusing, just stating. "I'm not saying it's intentional. Estimating is easier than tracking in the middle of a busy season, I understand that. But going forward, I need actual figures." She said it evenly, the way you said something that was just a fact, and then she went back to the ledger. Garrett stood there for a moment. She could feel the weight of it, the calculation happening, the deciding. Then he left without saying anything else. She let out a slow breath when he was gone. $12 a month over 8 months was almost $100 in fog. Money you couldn't account for, which meant money that couldn't be managed. On a ranch this size, it wasn't catastrophic, but it was the kind of thing that got worse if nobody said anything, and she had learned early that the things nobody said anything about were almost always the things that eventually broke you. She told Silas that night. Not as a complaint, she was careful about that. As information. He listened. "You want me to talk to him?" "Not yet. Let me see if he adjusts." Silas looked at her across the table. "All right. I just want you to know it happened." "I appreciate that." She went to bed that night thinking about the numbers, and also about the way Decker had watched her at dinner from down the table. Not hostile, but measuring, the way you measure a load before you decide how to lift it. She didn't need them to like her. That was the thing she had to keep clear in her own head. She needed them to work with her. Liking could come later or not at all, but the work had to function. She'd learned on the Mercer Ranch that warmth without competence meant nothing, and she wasn't going to flip that equation now that she finally had room to demonstrate which she was. The land dispute announced itself on day 9 in the form of a man named Hollis Crane. She was up on the north fence line when she saw the rider coming. She recognized the Crane brand on the horse before she got a clear look at the man. A C-bar, black on chestnut, the kind of mark that had been on the edges of Blackridge property in every conversation she'd heard from anyone in the county for the last 3 years. Hollis Crane was 50-something, built wide. With a white beard he kept trimmed in a way that said he thought of himself as a man of presentation. He rode up to the fence line and stopped on the other side, which was technically his side, and looked at Rowan with the particular expression of a man who had arrived expecting Silas and found something inconvenient instead. "Didn't know Silas had taken on a new hand," he said. "He hasn't," Rowan said. A beat. Crane looked at her more carefully. "I'm Rowan Blackridge," she said. The name felt strange in her mouth. Not wrong, just new, like a boot you hadn't broken in yet. Silas's wife. Crane's expression went through several things. Surprise first, then something calculating, then the smooth, managed pleasantness of a man who'd decided to play a longer game. "Well," he said, "congratulations. Didn't hear about the wedding." "It was small." "I imagine." He looked past her at the fence line, at the stakes she'd been remarking, at the survey notes in her hand. His eyes came back to her. "What are you doing out here?" "Checking the boundary stakes." She kept her voice even. "The survey from 1887 places the line 18 feet east of where your current stakes are sitting." Crane smiled. It didn't reach anything. "That's a complicated question. Silas and I have been going back and forth on it for a while." "I read the correspondence." She had. All of it, 2 nights ago, sitting at the desk in the study while Silas went over accounts at the other end of the table. 22 letters over 3 years, none of them resolved. A pattern of delay and deflection on Crane's side that was so consistent it had to be deliberate. The original survey documentation is pretty clear. Surveys have errors. This one has been validated twice. She looked at him. "I'm not trying to make trouble, Mr. Crane. I'm just telling you what the documentation says. Silas and I will be following up formally." Crane held her gaze for a moment. Then he touched the brim of his hat. "You tell Silas I said congratulations," he said, and turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come. Rowan watched him go. She didn't like the smile. Specifically, she didn't like the way it had come out when she'd mentioned the survey. Not defensive, not worried, but something more like amusement, like a man who had a card she didn't know about yet. She made a note in her book and kept walking the line. That evening, she asked Silas to walk her through every piece of paper related to the Crane boundary dispute. Every letter, every claim, every counterargument. Silas spread them across the dining table, and she read them in order, twice, while he answered her questions and poured coffee. Neither of them drank hot because they kept letting it sit. "He's been stalling," she said. "I know. But why? If the survey is clear, there's a water issue." Silas rubbed the back of his neck. "The creek that runs through the disputed 18 feet. If that land is ours, the water rights follow. Crane's been running cattle off that creek for years." "So he's not disputing the land," she said slowly. "He's protecting the water." "Essentially." She looked at the documents. "Has anyone ever offered him a formal water access agreement? Separate from the boundary question?" Silas was quiet for a moment. "No." "So he's been fighting the whole thing because he's afraid winning on the boundary means losing the water. But if you separated the two, he'd have no reason to keep blocking the boundary resolution." She looked at him across the table. "Has your lawyer tried this?" "My lawyer wants to litigate." "Lawyers always want to litigate." She picked up one of the letters. "This is solvable without court. It's going to take a direct conversation, not a letter." Crane doesn't respond well to direct conversations. "He responded to me today," she said. "He was measuring me, but he was listening." Silas looked at her in the way he had, that unhurried, taking full inventory look. "You want to handle it." "I want to try something before we spend more money on legal fees that haven't resolved anything in 3 years. She set the letter down. "If it doesn't work, we litigate. But let me try." He thought about it. She gave him the time to think. "All right," he said. She nodded. Then, "How much has this dispute cost us in the last 3 years?" Silas hesitated. "I'm asking because I need to know," she said. "Not to make you feel bad about it. I need the full picture of where the ranch is. Legal fees and the loss of use of that pasture," he did a rough calculation, "call it $400. $400 was not a small number on a working ranch. She filed it and didn't comment on it because that wasn't the point. The point was that she now knew what a solution was worth. She stayed at the table after Silas went to bed, going through the Crane documents one more time. The candle burned down. She heard the wind pick up outside, the familiar voice of weather she'd spent her entire life negotiating with. Somewhere around midnight, she heard small feet on the stairs. Clara appeared in the doorway in a nightgown, dark hair loose, looking at Rowan with the straightforward assessment that seemed to be her default mode. "You're still up," she said. "So are you." "I couldn't sleep." Clara came a few steps into the room. She looked at the papers spread across the table. "What are you doing?" "Working out a problem." What kind of problem? Rowan considered. Clara was 10, but she was the particular kind of 10 that was already closer to 14. A neighbor has been claiming land that isn't his. We're working out how to resolve it without it turning into a fight. Clara looked at the papers. Is it going to? I don't think so. She said it steadily, not because she was certain she wasn't, but because projecting certainty when you actually felt competent was a different thing from lying. Not if I do this right. Clara pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. It was an oddly comfortable thing, the two of them at the table at midnight, the papers between them. My mother used to stay up late, Clara said. It came out without preamble, the way children sometimes drop the heaviest things in the most sideways moments. Rowan kept her voice even. Yeah? She read a lot. Clara traced the edge of the table with one finger. Papa doesn't really read. I noticed. He pays attention, though. Clara looked up. He's like that. He doesn't read it, but he remembers everything you tell him. That's actually useful, Rowan said. I know. Clara looked back at the papers. Are you going to fix the ranch? Rowan felt the question land in an unexpected place. I'm going to try to make it better than I found it. That's the same thing. Not exactly. She thought about how to say it. Fixing means it was broken. I don't think Silas broke anything. I think there were problems that needed more hands than he had. Clara considered this with the seriousness she applied to most things. Then she got up, pushed the chair back in, and said, Okay, good night. Good night, Clara. She listened to the small feet go back up the stairs. Then she turned back to the Crane documents, pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward her, and started drafting the letter that would untangle 3 years of a problem everyone had been attacking from the wrong angle. Outside, the wind kept working at the roof the way it always had, and Rowan kept working at the papers the same way. Steady, without drama, without the expectation that anyone was watching. She'd learned a long time ago not to wait for an audience. The work was the same either way. The letter to Hollis Crane went out on a Monday. She kept it short, which took longer to write than a long letter would have. Every sentence had to carry exactly what she meant and nothing extra, because extra words in a dispute like this were just extra places for a man like Crane to find footholds. She proposed a meeting, not at the Blackridge house, not at Crane's, but at the judge's office in Sutter Creek, neutral ground with a witness built in. She separated the two questions clearly. The boundary line was one matter, the water access was another, and she proposed addressing them as two distinct agreements rather than one tangled fight. Silas read it before she sealed it. You didn't threaten him, he said. No. Most people lead with the threat. Most people in a 3-year dispute haven't resolved it, she said. I'm trying something else. He handed it back. She sealed it and sent it with the morning rider. Crane's answer came back Thursday. He'd meet them at Sutter Creek on the 15th. No other comment. Just the date and his signature, written in the large, deliberate hand of a man who wanted you to know he signed his name like he meant it. Silas looked at the response for a long moment. He agreed. He agreed to a meeting, Rowan said. That's not the same as agreeing to anything else. Don't get comfortable. But something had shifted. She could feel it in the house, in the way Silas moved through the morning after the letter came. Not relieved? Not yet, but lighter by some degree that she didn't have an exact word for. 3 years of a problem with no visible exit, and now there was at least a door visible in the wall, even if she hadn't opened it yet. Decker noticed. He noticed most things. She was learning. Filed them away behind that mustache and those careful eyes, and waited to see which direction they resolved before he committed to a position. He found her at the water trough that afternoon, ostensibly checking the pump, which didn't need checking. Heard Crane's coming to meet, he said. That's right. Decker worked the pump handle once. Last time anyone got Crane to come to a meeting was 1891. Didn't go well. What happened? Silas's lawyer showed up with a surveyor and a court summons. Decker released the handle. Crane left without sitting down. Rowan absorbed this. He left before anything was said? Before the man finished introducing himself. She thought about the way Crane had smiled when she mentioned the survey at the fence line. Not defensive. Amused. Like a man who already knew what the other side's opening move was going to be. He's been expecting the legal approach so long, it's become a reflex, she said. Decker looked at her. Something like that. We won't lead with the survey documents, she said. We'll lead with the water. The water's what he wants. Right. So if he walks in thinking we're going to take it, and instead we offer it as a separate formal agreement, not contingent on the boundary settlement, he's got no reason to walk out. Decker was quiet for a moment. Then, you figure out how to read people fast. I've had practice, Rowan said. He picked up his bucket and walked back toward the barn, and she watched him go, and it was not until he was almost at the door that he said, without turning around, Garrett adjusted his feed records. She didn't answer, but she noted it. The morning before the Sutter Creek meeting, Rowan's father showed up at Blackridge Ranch unannounced. She saw the Mercer wagon from the kitchen window and felt the specific kind of bracing that her body had developed over years as a response to her father's presence. Not fear, nothing that simple. More like the preparation you did before lifting something you knew was going to be heavier than it looked. Gerald Mercer climbed down from the wagon with the careful movements of a man whose knee had gotten worse since October. He looked at the house, at the barn, at the pasture stretching north. He looked at all of it with the expression of a man doing arithmetic on something that had turned out differently than he'd calculated. Rowan went out to meet him. Papa. Rowan. He looked past her briefly like he was checking for Silas. He around? He's out on the north line. Gerald nodded. Good. I came to talk to you. She waited. He did the thing he'd always done when he had something difficult to say. Shifted his weight to his good leg, looked at a middle distance, gathered himself like a man preparing to step over something uncertain. There's a thing I need to tell you about, before the meeting tomorrow. She felt the bracing deepen. What thing? He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the house again. Can we sit down somewhere? They sat on the porch steps, which felt appropriate in a way Rowan couldn't have explained, neither inside nor fully out, on the threshold of something. Gerald had his hat in his hands and turned it by the brim the way he did when he was uncomfortable, which was a habit he'd had her entire life. You know we've been struggling, he said. The ranch. I know. 3 bad seasons. I had to borrow against the property. She kept her voice even. How much? The first loan was from Callaway's bank 2 years ago. Then last spring I needed more and Callaway was... He stopped, turned the hat. I borrowed from Crane. The name landed like a stone in still water. She felt the ring spreading before she'd fully processed the center of it. Hollis Crane, she said. Yes. Papa. She was choosing her words with great care, the way you chose your footing on uncertain ground. How much and under what terms? $300, 12%. Due in full at 18 months, which is... He looked at his hat. Which is March. March was 4 months away. And if it's not paid? Gerald was quiet. Papa, if it's not paid, what did you sign? He looked up. She had never seen her father look genuinely old before, not the kind of old that was just age, the kind that was accumulated consequence, years of looking away from things that had eventually stacked up into something he couldn't ignore anymore. He gets first right to purchase the eastern 40 acres. The eastern 40. The water access. The parcel that bordered Crane's fence line. The same fence line she'd been standing at when Crane had smiled that particular smile. She stood up. Not dramatically, just because she needed to be standing. He already knows the water situation, she said. It wasn't quite to her father. It was the thought coming out while she tracked it. He knew before I sent the letter. He agreed to the meeting because he was already going to get what he wanted another way. The meeting was theater. He'd come to Sutter Creek tomorrow and be perfectly reasonable about the boundary line and the water agreement because in 4 months the debt would come due and the Mercers couldn't pay it, and the Eastern 40, with its water access, would transfer to Crane regardless. She turned around. Her father was watching her with an expression she had never quite seen on him before. Something between guilt and something more complicated. "Why didn't you tell me before?" she asked. "You'd just gotten married. You didn't want me to know you'd borrowed from the man Blackridge Ranch has been in dispute with for 3 years. I didn't think it would..." He stopped. "I didn't think it through." She'd heard that phrase her entire life, pointed at other situations, and had always let it pass. Right now she didn't have the patience for it. How much of the debt is serviced? Payments are current. It's the final lump sum in March that I can't. Have you told Adelaide about any of this? No. Mama? He looked away. She knows there are debts. Rowan stood on the porch of Blackridge Ranch and looked at her father's hands, still turning the hat, and felt the specific weight of being the person in a family who always found out the real thing too late because everyone else decided she didn't need to know until the real thing had grown teeth. I need you to go home, she said. I need to think. Rowan, I'm not angry. She said it plainly, and it was mostly true. The anger was there, but it was behind glass for now. She'd get to it later. I need to think before tomorrow. Go home. I'll be in contact. He stood, turned the hat one more time, and put it on. He looked at her for a moment with the look she'd seen on his face the day Silas had told him about the deeds, that fractional thing that was adjacent to respect, and this time it was mixed with something else that sat heavier. You'll figure it out, he said, not like a compliment, like an abdication. She watched the Mercer wagon move down the road until it cleared the ridge. Then she went inside and sat at the desk and looked at the Crane correspondence and started thinking in the clear, specific way she thought when someone was trying to remove a floor from under her without making noise about it. She told Silas that night after Clara was in bed. She put all of it on the table, the loan, the terms, the Eastern 40, the timeline, the fact that Crane had agreed to tomorrow's meeting knowing he held a card none of them had seen. She said it steadily, in order, the way you reported something that mattered rather than unloaded something that hurt. Silas listened without interrupting, which was one of the things about him she had started to genuinely rely on. Not a performance of patience, but the actual thing. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You want to cancel the meeting, he said. No. She'd thought about that. If we cancel, we show our hand. He knows we know, and he has no reason to negotiate because March gives him what he wants anyway. So we go. We go and we finalize the water agreement and the boundary resolution, and we get it signed and witnessed before he can use the Mercer debt as leverage. She paused. Once that's settled, the Eastern 40 changes in value to him. If he acquires it in March, even if he does, it's just land, not a strategy. Silas looked at her across the table. And the debt itself? I'm going to find a way to satisfy it before March. She said it with more certainty than she felt, and she trusted Silas to know the difference. He did. Rowan, $300 in 4 months. I know what it is. She folded her hands on the table. I need to look at our spring cattle numbers and the contract with the Hammond buyers. There may be a way to advance some of that. Those were allocated for equipment replacement. I know that too. She looked at him. I'm not asking you to decide tonight. I'm asking you to let me work it out and bring you the options. He looked at her for a long time. Then, what do you need from me tomorrow? Let me lead the water discussion. You handle the boundary documents. You know them better than I do. And don't react if Crane says something unexpected. Whatever he does, we don't let him see that we know about the loan. You think he'll try something? I think he might test us, she said. He's going to want to know if I know, so I'm going to act like I don't, and I'm going to be so reasonable about the water agreement that he has nothing to push against. Silas was quiet again. The candle between them had burned down to a stub. My first wife, he said, and then stopped. He said it so rarely, touched that subject so infrequently, that even when he moved toward it, there was something careful about the approach. She would have said the same thing, lead with what the other person wants. Rowan didn't answer immediately. She wasn't sure what the right thing was to say, and she'd found that when she wasn't sure, saying nothing was usually better than filling the space. She sounds smart, she said finally. She was. He looked at the candle. You're not alike. I want to be clear about that. I'm not saying this because I know, Rowan said. I didn't think you were. Good. He stood up, pushed the chair in. At the door, he stopped. For what it's worth, he said, I wouldn't have thought to separate the water from the boundary. 3 years I've been trying to solve that thing the same way and getting the same result. Sometimes you're too close to something to see a different angle. That's a generous way of saying I was stuck. You were managing 14 men and a 10-year-old and a legal dispute and a ranch, she said. You were doing a lot of things. You can only think about so much at once. He looked at her, but, good night, Rowan. Good night. She stayed at the desk after he left. She pulled the cattle ledgers. She pulled the Hammond contract. She started working out numbers in the margins, crossing things out, and rewriting, building the shape of a solution she couldn't quite see yet, but could feel at the edges, the way you could feel the outline of something solid in the dark before your eyes had adjusted. The Sutter Creek meeting happened on a cold, flat-sky morning that promised nothing in either direction. Judge Alderman's office smelled like pipe tobacco and old paper, and had exactly the right amount of formality, enough that men minded their words, not so much that they performed instead of talked. Crane arrived 4 minutes after Silas and Rowan, which Rowan noted as a choice rather than an accident. He had a lawyer with him, a thin man named Pryor, who smiled too much and wrote things down at the wrong moments. Crane looked at Rowan when he came in. Not surprised. He'd known she'd be there, but assessing. She smiled at him like a woman who'd had a perfectly ordinary week. "Mr. Crane," she said, "thank you for coming." He shook her hand. His grip was the kind that pressed too hard, testing. She pressed back evenly and let go first. They sat. Alderman had the boundary survey on the desk already, and Pryor immediately oriented toward it. That was their strategy. Start with the territory dispute, the thing they'd been winning on through delay. Rowan got there before him. "We'd like to start with the water access question," she said, "if that's agreeable. I think it's the piece with the most practical impact on both operations." Pryor opened his mouth. Crane put one hand up slightly, and Pryor closed it. "Go ahead," Crane said. She laid out what she'd drafted. A formal water access agreement, 30-year term, renewable, giving Crane's cattle the right to use the creek water from the section that would be confirmed as Blackridge land under the boundary settlement. A reasonable fee schedule. A joint responsibility clause for maintaining the creek banks. Crane listened. His face was the careful face of a man listening for the trap. There wasn't one. That was the thing she was counting on. That after 3 years of adversarial legal posturing, a proposal with no trap in it would take him longer to process than one that had a visible hook. "You're giving us permanent water access," Crane said slowly. "Formal access with defined terms," Rowan said, "which is better for you than informal use because it's protected regardless of who owns either property in the future. And in return, the boundary line is settled per the 1887 survey. No further dispute, no court involvement." Pryor was writing. Crane was looking at Rowan with the look she'd seen at the fence line, that measuring quality. But it was different now. Less amused, more genuinely uncertain, which was a better place for him to be. "You're not asking for the back pay on the disputed pasture use," Crane said. "No." "Why not?" "Because I want this resolved more than I want to win," she said. "Those aren't always the same thing." Silence. Alderman, who had not spoken since introducing himself, made a small sound that might have been approval. Crane looked at his lawyer. Something passed between them. A small recalibration. Pryor leaned in and spoke quietly near Crane's ear. Crane listened, nodded once, and looked back at Rowan. "I'll want my own lawyer to review the language before I sign anything." "Of course. We can have final documents ready within 10 days. Crane was quiet for another moment. He had the look of a man checking his own pockets and finding all the things he'd thought were there and finding something else he hadn't expected. "You've done this before," he said. Not quite a question. "No," Rowan said honestly. "First time." Something shifted in Crane's expression. Not warmth, not respect, not yet. But the particular shift that happened in people who'd made up their minds about you in advance and had just been handed evidence that contradicted their conclusion. "Your father-in-law was a hard negotiator," he said, which was a thing people said when they meant the opposite. "Silas is a good rancher," Rowan said. "He's been running an operation this size largely on his own. Some things benefit from a second set of eyes." Crane looked at Silas. Silas said nothing, which was what she'd asked for, and which he delivered without it looking like restraint. "I'll be in touch about the documents," Crane said, and stood. They shook hands again on the way out. This time his grip was different. Not testing, just a grip. She kept her face neutral until they were in the wagon and past the first bend in the road. Then she let out the breath she'd been holding in pieces for 2 hours. "He didn't mention the loan," Silas said. "No." She looked at the road ahead. "He's waiting to see if we know. As long as he thinks we don't, he has a reason to keep the meeting civil. He doesn't want to alert us before March. So we have a window. We have a window." She pulled her coat tighter. I worked out a partial solution last night, the Hammond Spring contract. If we advance the yearling sale by 6 weeks and negotiate the price up by 4%, I can free up $220. Your equipment fund covers the rest if we defer the new cultivator until fall. Silas thought about this for the length of a quarter mile. The cultivator was for the Eastfield expansion. I know, the Eastfield waits 1 season, the debt doesn't. Another quarter mile. 220 from the Hammond advance, 80 from equipment. That's 300. Plus the 12% interest that's accrued. Call it 340 to be safe. Hammond won't like advancing the sale. Hammond will like a 4% price increase, Rowan said. People generally like the thing that benefits them. You just have to find what it is. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then, when did you want to ride out to the Hammond place? Tomorrow, if you can spare a morning. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was adjacent to one. I find I can generally spare a morning when you've got a plan. She looked at him. He was watching the road, but there was something in the set of his jaw that was different from the tension she'd seen there for weeks. It was the look of a man who had put something down that he'd been carrying too long. Don't thank me yet, she said. I wasn't going to, he said. I was going to tell you that Decker asked me this morning if you'd consider looking at the winter feed contracts. Says he thinks we're overpaying the Greer supplier by about 8%. Decker asked about me looking at the contracts. His exact words were, that woman sees numbers different than the rest of us. Silas paused. He meant it well. I know he did, Rowan said. And she did. The Hammond place the next day, did the negotiation in 40 minutes over terrible coffee, and came back with a handshake agreement for the advanced yearling sale at a price 3.5% above the original contract. Not 4, but close. Hammond was pleased. Rowan let him think it had been his idea to settle on 3.5. She wrote to her father that afternoon. She kept it short, told him the debt to Crane would be satisfied before March, told him she'd need the exact interest figures and a copy of the signed note, and told him she'd have her own lawyer look at the terms before they paid anything. She didn't tell him how she felt about any of it. That was a conversation for another time when she had the space to have it cleanly. Her father wrote back in 3 days. The note was brief. He sent the requested documents. At the bottom, in the cramped handwriting he'd always had, he wrote, I know this wasn't what you needed. I'm sorry for it. She read that line twice. Then she filed the documents and moved on, because there was a winter feed contract to renegotiate and a signed boundary agreement to finalize and 12 ranch hands who were one by one in different ways and at different speeds, starting to take directions from her without the half-second pause they'd all had at the beginning. Garrett brought the corrected feed records on his own, without being asked. Set them on the desk in the study while she was working on the Greer contracts. The September through October figures are reconciled, he said. She looked up. Thank you. He stood there a moment. The new tracking method you set up. The weekly inventory log. Yes. It takes more time, I know. But it works. He said it like something. It cost him something to say, not because it wasn't true, but because the saying of it was its own kind of admission. You can see the waste points. We've already cut hay loss by about 2% this month, just from knowing where it's going. Rowan looked at him steadily. That'll add up over a winter. It will. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the corner of the desk. When you first came in here and started looking at the books, I wasn't easy about it. I noticed. The corner of his mouth moved. I imagine you did. He turned the hat in his hands, and for a moment she thought of her father and then let the comparison go. I'm easier about it now, he said. Good, she said, because I need your eyes on the Greer hay price comparison. You've been buying from them 3 seasons. You know the quality better than I can figure from paper. He sat down. She pushed the Greer file across the desk. They spent the next hour going through it together, and Rowan found herself thinking, not for the first time, that the hardest part of arriving somewhere new wasn't the visible opposition. The visible opposition was simple. It showed itself and you dealt with it. The hard part was the slow, incremental work of building enough trust that the people who'd started out skeptical stopped having to talk themselves into it. You couldn't rush it. You couldn't force it. You just had to show up day after day and do the work accurately and without a great deal of fanfare, and eventually the skepticism had less to hold on to. She'd been doing exactly that for the better part of her life. The difference now was that someone had finally given her the room to let it matter. The Greer file showed they were overpaying by 9%, which was a point more than Decker had estimated. She drafted the renegotiation letter that evening, and when she looked up from the desk, Clara was sitting on the bottom stair with a book, reading with the absorbed quiet of a child who'd slipped into the room at some point without making a sound. Rowan watched her for a moment. Clara turned a page without looking up. "How long have you been there?" Rowan asked. "A while." Clara didn't look up. "You don't notice when you're working." "I notice," Rowan said. "I just figured you weren't causing trouble." This time Clara looked up. Something in her face shifted. Not quite a smile, but the thing that happened in a face before a smile, when a person was deciding whether to let it out. "Decker says you're good," Clara said. "Decker said that?" "To Papa. I heard him." She went back to her book. "He said you were good and you didn't make a production of it." Rowan looked at the Greer letter in front of her. "High praise from Decker." "I think so," Clara said seriously. She finished the letter. Clara finished her chapter. The fire in the stove made the sounds fires made, and the wind outside went about its business, and the ranch sat in the dark in the way that ranches did when the work of the day was settled, and the work of tomorrow hadn't started yet. That specific, temporary quiet that anyone who'd grown up working the land knew was the closest thing there was to rest. Rowan sealed the Greer letter and set it with the morning correspondence. 3 weeks in. One boundary dispute on its way to resolution. One hidden debt surfaced and nearly handled. One skeptical foreman reviewing ledgers voluntarily at the same desk he'd once walked away from. She was not naive about any of it. Things that got better could get complicated again. People who adjusted didn't necessarily stay adjusted. Crane hadn't signed anything yet. Her father's letter sat in the file without an answer to the line she'd read twice. But she thought about the calf in the drainage ditch, about what it had felt like to pull it out of the cold water in the dark with no one watching. And she thought that this was something like the same thing, just much larger and requiring much longer in the water. She was good at that, the staying in. The Crane documents came back signed on a Thursday, 12 days after the Sutter Creek meeting, carried by Pryor the lawyer in a leather folder that he handed over at the door like he was delivering something mildly distasteful. Rowan signed her name beside Silas's on both the boundary resolution and the water access agreement, and when Pryor left, she held the folder for a moment in the hallway, without opening it again, just held it, because sometimes a thing you'd worked toward needed a second to become real before you moved on to the next thing. Silas came in from outside while she was standing there. "It's done?" he said. "It's done." He looked at the folder, then he looked at her. 3 years, he said. "I know." "Rowan." He stopped. He was not a man who said things he hadn't earned the words for, and she'd come to understand that when he stopped mid-sentence, it wasn't because he'd lost the thought, but because he was making sure it was the right one. "I want you to know that I understand what you did here. Not just the Crane thing, all of it. I don't take it for granted." She looked at him steadily. "I know you don't," she said. "That's one of the reasons this works." He nodded once. She handed him the folder and went back to the desk, because the Greer renegotiation had come back that morning with a counteroffer that needed answering, and resolution on one front had never meant pause on all the others. That was the thing about a working ranch. It didn't wait for you to finish celebrating. The Greer counteroffer was a reduction of 4% instead of 9%, with a proposed 3-year lock-in on pricing. She spent an afternoon with the numbers and wrote back offering 6% with a 2-year lock-in, which gave Greer the security of a longer contract without costing Blackridge the full value of the renegotiation. Greer's man came back in a week with 5.5% and the 2-year term, and she accepted it, which saved Blackridge approximately $60 annually on winter hay alone. Modest by itself, significant when stacked against the other adjustments she'd been making in the 3 weeks since the Crane meeting. Decker brought her the adjusted winter feed projections and set them on the desk without being asked. "The new price holds through next January," he said. "Yes. And if we shift the east pasture rotation earlier in the spring, we can reduce hay dependence by about 10% in the second half of the season." Decker looked at the projections. He had the expression he got when something made sense to him that he hadn't expected to make sense. "That's a grazing schedule change." "It is. I want to walk the east pasture with you before I put it on paper. You know the ground better than I do." He looked up at that. The thing she'd learned about Decker was that he responded to being consulted more than to being directed. Not because he was proud, but because his knowledge was genuine and he'd spent 11 years having it underused. When? Tomorrow morning if the weather holds. It'll hold, Decker said, in the way of a man who'd been reading weather on this particular piece of land for over a decade. She went to the east pasture the next morning with Decker and a notebook and no particular agenda beyond learning what he knew, and what she came back with 2 hours later was a grazing rotation plan that combined what she understood about carrying capacity with what Decker understood about this specific ground in this specific climate. It was better than what either of them would have produced alone. She didn't say that out loud, but she thought he knew it. That afternoon, Garrett found her in the barn and stood near the tack wall with his arms crossed, which was his posture when he had something to say that he hadn't fully talked himself into yet. "The yearling counts off by 2 head, he said. She turned around. "Which pen?" "South Holding." "Since when?" "I can't say exactly. I noticed it this morning, but the last full count was—" He pressed his lips together. 6 days ago. 6 days was a long window. "Any fence breaks on the south line?" "Nothing visible." She thought about it. "What about the Peel property? Their cattle get through the creek crossing sometimes, don't they?" Garrett's expression shifted fractionally. "Last spring they did. Fender on the east gate." "Check the gate first," she said. "If there's a gap, it's possible the yearlings push through toward the Peel side rather than the other direction." He went. She finished what she was doing in the barn, and then, because she'd learned not to wait on a problem that was still moving, went to saddle her own horse. She'd reached the gate latch when Decker appeared from the direction of the south pasture. "Yearlings are on the Peel side," he said. "Gate fender's bent. Looks like a collision. Probably one of the Peel bulls working the fence." "How many got through?" "Both of them. They're fine. Peel's hands have got them in their near pen." She rode over to the Peel place herself, which was not the way it had been handled before. Silas would have sent a hand, and the hand would have come back with the cattle and an update and a vague account of the conversation. Rowan went herself because she'd never met Darrow Peel formally, and she'd learned from the Crane situation that a dispute managed from a distance stayed a dispute longer than it had to. Darrow Peel was 60s, lean, with the permanent squint of a man who'd spent 50 years looking into distance and wind. He was at his near pen when she rode up, and he looked at her with the particular look of a man who'd heard things and was now calibrating them against the real version. "Mrs. Blackridge," he said. "Not unfriendly. Careful." "Mr. Peel, I appreciate your people holding them." She got down, which was a choice. You stayed mounted when you wanted authority. You got down when you wanted conversation. "The gate fender. I'll have my men fix it today if that's agreeable, or if you'd prefer we coordinate on a more permanent repair, I'm open to that too." Peel looked at her. "Silas usually just sent someone to collect the cattle." "I know. I thought I'd come myself since we haven't met properly." He was quiet for a moment, doing the recalibrating. "Coffee?" he said finally. "Thank you, yes." They sat on his porch for 20 minutes over coffee that was better than Hammond's, and she learned that Peel had been ranching this ground for 32 years and had 3 opinions on every subject and was willing to share all of them if you gave him the opening. She gave him the opening. She asked about the creek crossing, about the history of the fence line between their properties, about the winter grazing patterns on his side. He talked. She listened with the quality of attention she'd learned produced more information than most questions did. By the time she left with the yearlings, Darrow Peel had suggested, unprompted, that they might coordinate on spring branding dates to avoid competing for the same contracted hands. She rode her back to Blackridge with 2 yearlings trailing behind her and the quiet satisfaction of knowing she'd turned a minor problem into a minor alliance, which was the kind of math that didn't show up in any ledger, but compounded over time. The letter from her father arrived the 2nd week of December. She saw the handwriting on the envelope and felt the familiar bracing, and then opened it and read it standing at the desk, and the bracing turned into something different and more complicated. He had, without telling her, gone to see a county clerk named Adler about the property transfer papers, the eastern 40 acres at the Mercer Ranch. He had, in consultation with this clerk, filed a document that he described in the letter as a protective measure, a deed restriction that, as far as she could parse the legal language he'd copied out, would make it significantly harder for Crane to exercise his purchase right even if the debt came due unpaid. He'd done it because he'd spoken to a neighbor who'd suggested it, and the neighbor had a cousin who'd used a similar filing to delay a forced sale. He hadn't told her. He hadn't told his own lawyer. He had walked into a county office and filed paperwork on a situation that she was actively managing, based on advice from a neighbor's cousin. And he'd done it without asking because she understood reading between every line. He had wanted to do something useful, and this was the thing he'd found. She set the letter down. She picked it up again and read the last paragraph. I know you have this handled. I just wanted to do something that helped. If I've made it worse, I'm sorry for it. She stood there for a moment with the letter in her hand. The filing was probably fine. It might even be useful. But she didn't know that yet, and she needed to find out before she could know whether she was dealing with an asset or a complication, which meant she needed her lawyer to look at it, which meant she needed to ride to Sutter Creek again and spend money she'd allocated elsewhere. She was still standing there when Silas came in. He read her face, which he'd gotten better at over the past weeks. Not the dramatic parts. Those were easy to read on anyone, but the smaller registrations she mostly kept internal. What happened? She handed him the letter. He read it, set it on the desk, looked at the window. He said. That's one word for it. He meant well. He always means well, she said, and heard the edge in her own voice. She wasn't going to pretend it wasn't there. He means well, and then he does the thing that makes more work for everyone around him, and is surprised when it turns out that way. Silas was quiet. I'm not saying it's catastrophic, she said. It might even help. I don't know yet. That's the problem. I don't know yet, and I need to. And now I have to spend a day in Sutter Creek to find out whether my father's well-intentioned filing made this better or handed Crane a legal argument I haven't seen yet. I'll ride with you, Silas said. You don't need to. I know I don't need to. He picked up his hat from the hook by the door. I want to. She looked at him for a moment. The easy thing to say was that she had it, that she didn't need company, that she was capable of making the ride alone because she'd been capable of doing everything alone for her entire life, and this was no different. She didn't say it. She was trying to be honest about the difference between not needing help and not wanting it. Thank you, she said. They rode to Sutter Creek the next morning in cold that came off the ridge like something with intent. Their lawyer, a small, precise man named Callum Foster, who had an office above the feed merchant and thought about everything twice before answering. Read the filing and the original loan note and the deed restriction document all the way through without speaking. Then he read the deed restriction again. Interesting, he said. Good interesting or bad interesting? Rowan asked. The filing is valid, Foster said. Your father had the standing to file it. What it does, he traced a line in the document with one finger, is complicate Crane's purchase right, but not eliminate it. If the debt comes due unpaid, Crane would need to go to court to exercise the right rather than doing it through a straight transfer. That buys time. How much time? In this county, courts move slowly. 3 months, possibly 4 beyond the March due date. She thought about this. 3 or 4 months was not nothing. It was the difference between a crisis and a managed problem. Does it give Crane grounds to challenge the water agreement? Foster looked at the boundary documents she'd brought. He read for a while. No, he said. These are separate instruments. The water agreement stands regardless of the deed situation. She let out a slow breath. Your father's filing was sloppy, Foster said, with the precise man's particular discomfort for imprecision. But it didn't break anything. And if you're going to satisfy the debt before March anyway, we are. Then it becomes moot entirely. The restriction only activates on default. She looked at Silas. Adelaide arrived on a Saturday, 3 weeks before Christmas, with a carpet bag and a face that had been crying recently and was now pretending it hadn't. Rowan saw her from the kitchen window and was on the porch before Adelaide had finished tying her horse. What happened? I'm fine, Adelaide said. You're not fine. What happened? Adelaide looked at her. She had Ruth Mercer's coloring and Gerald Mercer's jawline and neither of their ability to avoid saying things that were true. Mama has accepted an offer, she said. For me. From Thomas Hale. Rowan knew Thomas Hale. Everyone in the county knew Thomas Hale in the way you knew a splinter, present, irritating, and the kind of thing that got worse if you left it alone. He was 43, had been married once before under circumstances that no one discussed directly, ran a middling cattle operation north of Hadley Creek, and had, on two separate occasions at county gatherings, said things about women in business that Rowan had been within earshot of and had chosen, at the time, not to respond to. "She accepted on your behalf," Rowan said. "She told Thomas I was interested. I am not interested." "Did you tell Mama that?" "I told Mama that." Adelaide's voice was steady, but the steadiness was the kind that took effort. "She told me I was being impractical and that at 21 I should understand my situation." Rowan stood on the porch of Black Ridge Ranch and felt the particular cold that came from recognizing a pattern you'd lived inside for a long time being applied to someone you loved. "Come inside," she said. She made coffee. Adelaide sat at the kitchen table and didn't cry, which Rowan suspected was taking more effort than it looked. Clara appeared at the top of the stairs, saw the situation, and made the surprisingly mature choice to retreat back to her room, which Rowan noted and appreciated. "What do you want?" Rowan asked, setting the cups down. Adelaide looked at her. "What?" "Not what Mama wants. Not what's practical by her accounting. What do you want?" Adelaide seemed to have not been asked this recently. She looked at her coffee. "I don't want Thomas Hale." "That's what you don't want. What do you want?" A long pause. There's a woman in town, Judith Farrow. She runs the school now that Mrs. Oakes retired. She said she could use help with the younger grades and she'd pay a small wage." Adelaide looked up. "I wanted to talk to Mama about it, and instead she told me about Thomas Hale." Rowan looked at her sister. Adelaide had always existed in the glass case their mother had built, preserved, presented, waiting. It had looked like privilege from the outside, and parts of it were, but a glass case was still a glass case regardless of how nicely it was made. "You want to teach," Rowan said. "I think I'd be good at it." "I think you probably would be." Adelaide looked at her like someone who'd been told something she'd needed to hear for a long time and wasn't entirely sure how to receive it. "Mama won't. Mama isn't who you need to convince," Rowan said. "You need to talk to Judith Farrow first, find out the actual terms. Then you go to Mama with a specific plan, not a general wish. Specific is harder to dismiss." "She'll still say no." "Maybe. But Adelaide," Rowan chose her next words carefully, because she'd thought about this kind of thing her whole life and had earned the right to say it plainly. "Mama's no isn't the last word on your life. It feels like it is because she's made it feel that way, but it isn't." Adelaide was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is that what it was like for you, before?" Rowan considered giving the diplomatic answer. Then she decided Adelaide was 21 and had earned the real one. "Yes," she said. "It was exactly like that." Adelaide looked at her coffee again. "I don't know how you just made a decision and did it." "I was scared," Rowan said. "I was scared the whole time. I'm still scared sometimes." She paused. "Being scared isn't a sign you're doing the wrong thing. It's usually a sign you're doing something that matters." Adelaide stayed 3 days. She slept in the spare room and helped with the morning work without being asked, which surprised Rowan until she remembered that Adelaide had grown up on the same ranch and knew what work looked like, even if she'd been managed away from most of it. On the second evening, Clara came downstairs and found Adelaide at the table and, after a period of mutual assessment, sat down and asked Adelaide if she could teach her the card game she'd seen her playing. And the two of them spent an hour at the kitchen table with a worn deck and increasing noise, and Rowan listened from the study and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for a while. On the morning of the third day, Adelaide said she was going home to talk to Judith Farrow, and then to her mother, in that order. "What will you say to Mama?" Rowan asked. "That I've taken a position with the school starting in January, and that I intend to honor it." Adelaide pulled on her coat with the particular set of her shoulders that Rowan recognized as something borrowed. She'd been watching Rowan do it for years without knowing that was what she was doing. And if she wants to discuss Thomas Hale, she can discuss him with Thomas Hale herself. Rowan looked at her sister. "Too much?" Adelaide asked. "No," Rowan said. "But maybe end at the first sentence and let her respond before you say the second one." Adelaide almost smiled. "Right." She picked up her bag. At the door she stopped, turned around, and did something she'd never once done in 26 years of being sisters. She hugged Rowan. Not a polite surface hug, a real one, the kind that conveyed something too large for words and didn't try to compress it. Rowan held on for a moment, then let go. Tell Clara goodbye, Adelaide said. She's... She paused. She's remarkable, actually. She is, Rowan said. Don't tell her I said so. She'll use it as leverage. Adelaide laughed, a real one, unguarded, and went out to her horse and rode down the road, and Rowan stood on the porch until she was out of sight. What happened with Gerald Mercer came in January, which Rowan had not anticipated and probably should have. She'd been tracking the debt timeline, managing the Hammond advance, coordinating with Foster on the final payment paperwork. The plan was solid. She'd verified it from 3 directions. The money would be in Crane's hands by the 15th of February, 6 weeks before the March due date, with documentation that left no ambiguity about the debt being fully discharged. She had not, in managing all of this, thought carefully enough about what her father might do with the feeling of being managed. Gerald Mercer appeared at Blackridge Ranch on a January morning without warning, the second time, and she felt the bracing again before she'd even opened the door. But this time his expression was different from the last time. Last time he'd carried guilt. This time he carried something stiffer. He came inside. He sat at this kitchen table. He waited until Silas had left the room. She noticed that, the waiting, and then he put a paper on the table and pushed it toward her. She looked at it. It was a legal document. Her name was in it, alongside Silas's, alongside a property description she recognized as the primary Blackridge parcel, the main deeded land, the house, the core pasture acreage. "What is this?" she asked, though she could already read it. "A challenge," he said, "to the deed transfer." She looked up. Gerald Mercer had the expression of a man who had rehearsed something and was now discovering that the rehearsed version and the live version felt different. "Your marriage was... There are grounds to argue that you signed under conditions that weren't, that the partnership deed structure isn't standard, and there may be questions about the circumstances." "Papa," her voice came out flat. "Stop." He stopped. "You're challenging my property rights," she said. "On the basis of what exactly?" "On the basis that a woman who married 6 weeks ago being deeded equal rights to an estate this size isn't what?" She kept her voice even. "It costs something. Isn't normal? Isn't appropriate? Isn't how things are done?" Gerald looked at the table. He had not, she realized, thought this through past the filing point. He'd had a feeling, something threatened, something unsettled, some version of the long-held arithmetic of his household that had been disrupted and wouldn't reorder itself. And he'd acted on the feeling the way he always acted on feelings, which was imprecisely and without asking. "She put you up to this?" Rowan said. "Mama? Your mother has concerns about, did she file this or did you?" A pause. "I filed it. Because she asked you to." He said nothing. She sat with that for a moment. The anger was not behind glass anymore. She let herself feel the full dimension of it. Not the hot, unmanaged kind, but the specific kind that comes from clarity, from seeing a thing without the instinct to excuse it. Her father had come to her house and put a legal challenge to her name on her property, on her kitchen table, because her mother was uncomfortable with how things had turned out. After everything. After 3 years of holding the Mercer Ranch together invisibly. After 6 weeks of turning Blackridge problems into solutions. After a lifetime of being the one who stayed in the cold water. "Papa," she said, "I want you to listen to me." He looked up. "I'm not going to be moved from this property. Not by this document, not by any other document filed without legal standing, not by Mama's discomfort, not by the county's opinion of a woman's name on a deed." She said it without raising her voice, which made it land more solidly than volume would have. "You know what I've done here. Not because I've told you. I haven't told you most of it. But because you know me. You've known me 26 years. You know exactly what I'm capable of when someone gives me the room." Gerald Mercer's jaw was tight. "I love you," she said. "I am also telling you clearly and without any confusion that if you pursue this, I will defend it fully. I will win. And what it will cost is whatever is left of the relationship between us that is still worth having." She pushed the document back across the table. "Take this home," she said. "Talk to Mama. Tell her the debt is being satisfied in February, and there is no further leverage available to anyone on this question. And then decide what you want the rest of this to look like." Her father sat for a long moment. His hands were on the table, and she looked at them. The knuckles she'd known her whole life, the old scar on his left thumb from a fence wire 20 years ago, the ring that had been on his finger since before she was born. He picked up the document, stood, put his hat on. At the door he turned around and there was something in his face she had never seen directed at her in her 26 years. Not admiration, not pride, not the face he'd made when Silas had mentioned the deeds. This was more uncomfortable than those, and more honest. It was the look of a man seeing someone clearly for the first time and understanding, with the full weight of that understanding, how long he should have been seeing them this way. He didn't say anything. He went out. She listened to the wagon move down the road. Silas appeared in the doorway. She didn't know how much he'd heard. By his face, enough. "Are you all right?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said. "I think so." She looked at the kitchen table where the document had been. "He won't file it. He'll take it home and think about it, and he won't file it." "How do you know?" "Because somewhere underneath all of it, he knows it's wrong." She looked up. "He's not a bad man. He's a man who spent a long time doing the easier thing, and the easier thing keeps turning out to be the wrong thing, and it's catching up with him." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then, "He came here in January to challenge your property rights. That's not a small thing." "No," she said, "it isn't. You're not as calm about it as you sound." She looked at him. He was right. She wasn't. The anger was real, and the hurt underneath it was real, and the exhaustion of being the person who absorbed the cost of everyone else's uncertainty was real. She was just very practiced at not letting those things run ahead of what needed doing. "I'll be angry about it later," she said, "when there's room for it." He crossed the kitchen. He put his hand on her shoulder. Not a gesture of comfort exactly, or not only that, more like a person standing beside you in a specific way that said they understood the weight and weren't going anywhere. She put her hand over his for a moment, then let go and went back to the desk, because the Hammond advance was finalizing at the end of the week, and there were numbers to confirm, and the ranch didn't wait, and she was the kind of person who worked better when her hands had something to do. Gerald Mercer did not file the document. She'd known he wouldn't, the way you know certain things about people you've spent your whole life watching, not because they're predictable in the comfortable sense, but because you've seen enough of them to understand where their limits actually are, underneath all the noise. Her father was a man who did the easier thing, and filing a legal challenge against his own daughter's property rights was, in the cold light of January, not the easier thing. It was the thing her mother had wanted when she was angry, and Ruth Mercer had a talent for making her anger feel like logic in the moment. But Gerald had apparently spent a night or two with it and come back to himself. Rowan knew because Foster sent word in late January that no challenge had been registered at the county clerk's office. She read the note, put it in the file, and went back to the Hammond advance paperwork, which was the more pressing thing. She didn't mention it to Silas. He didn't ask. They had, in the 3 months since November, developed the kind of working rhythm that didn't require narrating every development to each other. She handled what she was handling, he handled what he was handling, and at the end of the day they compared notes. The way two people compare notes when they're genuinely interested in what the other found. It was not what she'd expected marriage to feel like. She hadn't had strong expectations about it, actually, which had probably helped. What she'd expected was a transaction with human complexity, and that was roughly what it was. And inside that complexity, something was growing that she didn't have a clean word for yet. Not love, or not the version she'd read about in the books she'd grown up with, where it arrived as an event and then simply existed. This was more like infrastructure, like built piece by piece, load-bearing without announcing itself, noticeable mainly when you thought about what would be missing if it weren't there. She thought about that sometimes, late at the desk, when the house was quiet. The Hammond advance came through on the 31st of January. She rode to Foster's office in Sutter Creek on the 1st of February with the full amount in a banker's draft, $342, covering the principal and the accrued interest, and a small margin on top to account for any calculation she'd made that was slightly off. Foster prepared the discharge documents and sent them to Crane's lawyer that same afternoon. Pryor confirmed receipt by return rider on the 3rd. The debt was gone. The deed restriction her father had filed became irrelevant as of the moment the discharge was recorded. The eastern 40 acres of the Mercer Ranch was no longer anybody's leverage over anything. The Crane boundary agreement and the water access agreement were already signed and filed. The entire structure that Crane had been building, quietly and over years, with loan money and fence line delays and stalling letters, all of it dissolved in the space of a Thursday afternoon, recorded in a county office above a feed merchant, handled by a small, precise man who noted it in his ledger and moved on to the next item. She rode home in weather that couldn't commit to anything. Not quite snow, not quite rain, the kind of damp cold that just sat on everything. She wasn't celebrating, that wasn't quite her mode, but there was something in the ride that felt different from the usual rides, some quality of the road and the gray sky that seemed like its own kind of acknowledgement. When she got back, Decker was at the gate, which was not unusual. He looked at her face, which apparently told him something. "Done?" he said. "Done," she said. He nodded. He opened the gate. He didn't say anything else, which was exactly right. Silas found out when she told him over dinner, matter-of-factly, the way she reported most things. Here is what happened. Here is where we are now. He listened. He set down his fork. He looked at her across the table in the way that she had come to understand meant he was feeling something more than his face was showing. "The full amount," he said, "plus interest." "In February?" "February 3rd. She picked up her own fork. "We'll want to revisit the equipment budget in April. The cultivator deferral cost us some efficiency this winter that we'll need to account for in the spring schedule." Silas was quiet for a moment. "Rowan," he said. She looked up. "Can you, just for a moment, not go to the next thing?" She looked at him. He wasn't asking her to be someone she wasn't. He was asking her to stay in the room she was in for another minute before moving to the next one. She recognized the difference. "Okay," she said. 3 years, he said. "I couldn't close that out in 3 years. You did it in 3 months. I had information you didn't have, and I had a different angle on it. You had the same information I had. You read it differently." She thought about how to say the true thing without it sounding like something it wasn't. "You were running this ranch alone. You were raising Clara alone. You were managing the dispute alone, the legal fees alone, the daily operation alone. You didn't close it out in 3 years because you were doing 15 other things at the same time, and there was no one else to carry part of the weight." She paused. "That's not a failure of yours. That's just too much for one person." He looked at her steadily. "I didn't marry you to rescue you," she said. "I married you because you were the first person in my life who looked at me and saw what I was actually worth, and I intended to prove you right." Something moved through his face that was more unguarded than she usually saw from him. He picked up his fork again. "You have," he said quietly. "Thoroughly." Clara, who had been eating in the silence of a child who understood when the adults were having a conversation she shouldn't interrupt, said, without looking up from her plate, "Are we done being serious? Because I have a question about the spring rotation." Rowan looked at her. "You have a question about the spring rotation." Decker explained the pasture change. "I think there's a problem with the northeast corner timing." Clara looked up. Both adults were staring at her. "What?" "How long have you been listening to ranch conversations?" Silas asked. "Always," Clara said, with the patience of a child who had assumed this was already known. "You talk at dinner every night. Where else would I listen?" Rowan put down her fork and laughed. A real one, the kind that came from somewhere unexpected, and Silas looked briefly startled and then laughed too, and Clara looked at both of them with the expression of a person who had made a reasonable point and found the response disproportionate but was willing to wait it out. "Tell me about the northeast corner," Rowan said, when she'd gotten herself back. Clara told her. She was not wrong about the timing issue. Rowan added it to her notes for the morning. Adelaide wrote in mid-February. 2 pages, which was longer than Adelaide usually wrote, in the quick-moving handwriting she had when she was pleased about something. She had started at the school the first week of January. Judith Farrow had given her the 2nd and 3rd grades, 12 children, a classroom that leaked at the northeast corner when it rained, and a salary that was modest but was hers. She wrote about a boy named Samuel who couldn't read at grade level and had been written off by the previous teacher and who Adelaide was working with separately at the end of each day. She wrote about the other teachers. She wrote about Judith Farrow, who was apparently formidable and funny, and had been running the school for 4 years with a combination of competence and stubbornness that Adelaide clearly admired. At the bottom of the 2nd page, in smaller writing, she wrote, "Mama has not fully accepted it, but she has stopped arguing about Thomas Hale, which is its own kind of progress. Papa seems I don't know how to describe it exactly. He seems quieter than he used to be. Not sad exactly, more like he's thinking about things. Rowan read that paragraph twice. She wrote back. She told Adelaide about Samuel, that the reading problem she'd described sounded like something she'd seen in children who processed letters differently than most, and there were some approaches she'd read about that Adelaide might find worth trying. She told her about the spring rotation and Clara's catch on the northeast timing. She told her that the Crane situation was fully resolved. She didn't write about their father. She wasn't ready to put that into words in a letter yet. Some things needed more time before they could be said right. March arrived without drama, which was its own kind of statement after the months that had preceded it. The Crane debt due date passed on a Tuesday. Nothing happened because there was no debt. The discharge was recorded. The Mercer Eastern 40 remained the Mercer Eastern 40. The water flows where it's always flowed. 2 weeks later, Hollis Crane rode to the Blackridge fence line, not the disputed section, the main road fence, and asked to speak with Rowan. She came out to the fence and he sat his horse and she stood and they looked at each other across the wire. "The water arrangement is working," he said. "Good. My men aren't losing time at the crossing anymore." "I'm glad to hear it." He looked at her for a moment. He had the expression he'd had twice before in her experience of him, the one where he was revising something he'd decided in advance. "You knew about the Mercer loan," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes." "When?" "Before the Sutter Creek meeting." He absorbed this. Whatever calculation he was doing, it took a moment. "And you still came in with the water offer." "The water offer was the right solution regardless of the loan," she said. "The loan was a separate problem. I didn't want to mix them." Crane was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved between them. His horse shifted its weight, and he steadied it without looking down, the automatic movement of a man who'd been on horseback most of his life. "I've been ranching this ground 31 years, he said finally. "I've sat across tables from a lot of people. Most of them. When they had an advantage, they used it, all of it, as hard as they could." "I know," Rowan said. "You didn't." "No. Why not?" She thought about how to answer honestly without it sounding like a speech. "Because I wanted a resolved situation more than I wanted to win, and because using the loan would have poisoned the water agreement. You can't build something solid on a foundation of somebody being cornered." She paused. "I'd rather have a neighbor than a defeated enemy. Defeated enemies look for opportunities." Crane looked at her for a long moment, then he touched the brim of his hat. "Mrs. Blackridge," he said, in the tone of a man who had arrived at a conclusion. "Mr. Crane." He turned his horse and rode back down the road. She watched him go and thought about the smile he'd had at the fence line back in October, the amused, card-holding smile of a man who thought he already knew the ending. He wasn't smiling like that now. She wasn't sure what to call the expression he'd left with, but it was different, and different was enough. The conversation with her father happened in April, which was when it was ready to happen. She hadn't planned it. She'd ridden over to the Mercer place to look at a fence repair her father had written to ask her opinion on, something about the post spacing on the north pasture that he couldn't figure out why it kept failing. And they'd walked the fence line together, and somewhere in the walking she'd understood that this was the conversation, that it had been waiting for a practical occasion to arrive in because her father couldn't start things from nothing. He needed a door to come through. They walked the fence. She told him the post spacing problem was secondary to the soil compaction. He was driving posts into ground that had been overworked and wasn't holding. He needed to move the line 3 feet east and let the current ground rest. He looked at what she was pointing at, and she could see him understanding it, and she watched him absorb the fact that he'd been fixing the wrong thing for 3 seasons. "Should have asked you sooner," he said. She didn't answer immediately. They walked a little further. "Papa," she said. "I know," he said. "Let me say it anyway." He stopped walking. He turned and looked at her with the wind in his face and the March into April cold still in the air, and his hat pulled down the way he always wore it when he was outside working. And she looked at him and saw the man she'd known her whole life. The man who'd turned away, who'd chosen the easier direction, who'd filed a legal document in January and then retreated from it because he knew it was wrong before the ink was dry. "You didn't see me," she said. "For most of my life, you didn't see what I was doing or what it was worth. And I know that's partly because I didn't make it visible. I just did the work and moved on because I'd learned not to expect anything from expecting things. But some of it was you. Some of it was that you'd decided what I was before you'd actually looked. Gerald Mercer's jaw was tight. He was looking at her and not away from her, which was the most she could ask. The deed challenge in January, she said. I need you to understand what that was. That wasn't just bad timing or poor judgment. That was you coming to take something that was finally mine because Mama was uncomfortable and you didn't know how to hold ground against her any better than you'd known how to hold ground for me. He breathed in through his nose. Let it out. You're right, he said. She waited. I've spent a long time doing the thing that caused the least argument in the immediate moment, he said. I know what that cost you. I've known for a while, if I'm being straight about it. He stopped, turned his hat brim, the old habit. You were capable. You always just handled things. It was easy to let you. Yes, she said. It was. He looked at the fence line. I should have come to see you do it, is what I should have done. All those years, I should have been paying attention. She stood with that for a moment. The anger wasn't gone. She wasn't going to pretend it was. And she didn't think pretending served either of them. But underneath the anger was something that had been waiting longer, something that recognized in this moment, imperfect and too late, and in the middle of a field in the cold, that the scene was happening now. That it was happening at all. I know you're proud of me, she said, even if you don't always know how to say it. He looked at her. I am, he said plainly, without decoration. I have been, for longer than I've said. She nodded once. That matters, she said. It doesn't fix everything, but it matters. They walked the rest of the fence line talking about post depths and soil composition, and by the time they got back to the gate, her father had a clear plan for the repair, and she had worked through the conversation far enough to know it wasn't finished, but was at least started in the right direction. Some things didn't resolve cleanly. That was the honest version. She rode home in the afternoon light thinking about how long certain understandings took to arrive, and how the waiting for them was not the same as the understanding being absent. Sometimes people just needed more time and more evidence and more consequence before they could see what had been in front of them all along. She didn't excuse it, she just understood it, which was its own kind of different. Spring came to Black Ridge Ranch with the particular energy that followed a hard winter. Everything that had been compressed and waiting suddenly moving at once, the pastures greening faster than you expected, the cattle restless and loud, the days stretching in a way that felt like a statement. Rowan walked the east pasture in the early morning before anyone else was up, which had become her habit. An hour of quiet while the light came in low from the east, when the ranch was most itself, before the noise and decisions of the day. She checked the rotation markers she'd moved with Decker in February. The grass was coming in right. The northeast corner that Clara had questioned at dinner was actually doing better than the projections suggested, which she made a note of because it was good information and also because she wanted to tell Clara. She'd been thinking about Clara a lot in those morning walks, about what it meant to raise a child to understand that her voice counted, that her observations mattered, that the things she noticed were worth saying out loud. Clara was 10, and she was already asking questions about carrying capacity and water tables, and why certain decisions were made rather than others. And Rowan answered every question with the full answer rather than the simplified one, because the simplified answer was a way of telling someone that you didn't think they could handle the real one, and Clara could handle the real one. She always could. It wasn't the mother relationship either of them would have chosen from the start. It was the one that had arrived, and that they were building in the only way you actually built anything, by showing up consistently, by being honest, by not performing a warmth that wasn't there yet, and letting the warmth that was there be what it actually was. Clara had asked her 3 weeks ago, in the matter-of-fact tone she used for all her significant questions, whether Rowan missed her own family. Rowan had thought about it honestly before answering. I see them, she'd said. My sister wrote last week. My father came by Tuesday. That's not what I asked. I know. She'd looked at Clara. I miss the idea of a family that saw me more clearly when I was growing up. I don't miss being invisible. Clara had considered this with her usual thoroughness. You're not invisible here, she said. No, Rowan said. I'm not. She'd meant it. That was the thing she kept coming back to on the morning walks. Not as a conclusion that closed anything, but as a point of reference. She had spent 26 years learning how to function without being seen, building competence as a substitute for recognition, getting very good at doing things in the dark without anyone watching. And now she was somewhere that the doing was seen. Not celebrated, not performed about, just seen, noted, valued, in the practical way that real respect actually moved, which was quietly, in the way it shaped decisions and conversations, and the weight of whose name was on the paper. She wasn't finished becoming what she was going to be. She knew that. The ranch was better than it had been 6 months ago, and would need to be better still in 6 months more. The relationship with Silas was something she was learning to trust gradually and without rushing, which felt right in a way that rushing would have undermined. Clara was still 10 and would be 12 and then 15, and those would each bring their own navigation. Her father was still her father. Her mother was still her mother. Adelaide was teaching 2nd and 3rd grade and writing letters that were getting longer every month. None of it was finished. That was the thing about a life as opposed to a story. It didn't resolve into a clean frame and hold still. It kept moving, and the question was just whether you moved with it or got left standing in one place while everything else went on. She walked the east pasture and checked the rotation markers and made her notes, and then turned back toward the house, where she could see smoke from the kitchen stove starting up, which meant Silas was awake and making coffee badly, which he did every morning, and which she had decided to find endearing rather than correctable. The morning light came flat and gold across the pasture and lit the top of the barn and the fence lines that she'd walked 100 times in 3 seasons, and now knew the way you knew something that was yours. Not owned exactly, but belonged to. Claimed in the way that labor claims things, that care claims things, that showing up every day in the cold and the mud and the ordinary difficulty of a working life slowly makes something yours. She thought about the drainage ditch, about the calf in the dark water, the cold coming up past her knees, the mud that didn't want to let go. She thought about the fact that there had been no audience, that she'd done it because it needed doing, and she was the one there. She thought about a man she hadn't yet met standing in the dark on the other side of a fence line, watching. The watching had changed everything. Not because it made the act worth something it hadn't been worth before. The calf was worth saving regardless of whether anyone saw it, but because it turned out that being seen, actually seen, by one person who understood what they were seeing was the kind of thing that could unlock a door you'd stopped believing was there. She reached the porch, stomped the mud from her boots the way she'd done her whole life, pushed through the door into the warmth and the smell of coffee and the sound of Clara moving around upstairs, and Silas turning from the stove to look at her with the easy directness that she'd come to know as his version of a greeting, the way some people said good morning, and he just looked at you like you were exactly who he'd expected to walk through the door. "Good walk?" he said. "East pasture's coming in ahead of schedule," she said. Clara's timing catch was right. The northeast corner has better moisture retention than the projections. Clara will have an opinion about that. Clara has an opinion about everything. Rowan hung up her coat. "It's one of her better qualities." Silas poured her the coffee, which was too strong and not quite hot enough, which it always was, and she took it without comment and sat down at the table and looked at the morning correspondence he'd already sorted, a pattern they'd fallen into without discussing it, the small ways a shared life organized itself around two people's natural habits. Silas sat across from her. They drank the imperfect coffee in the early morning quiet, and the ranch breathed around them, and upstairs Clara's feet moved toward the stairs. Outside, the spring light kept coming. Rowan Blackridge was 27 years old. Her name was on every deed. She was not invisible. She was not rescued. She was exactly where the work had brought her, which turned out to be the only place worth arriving at. Not handed to you, not stumbled into, but built in the dark with your own hands, piece by piece, in the cold water, without waiting for anyone to watch. That was her story. That was the whole of it. Not the ending. There wasn't one yet. Just the proof that the beginning was real.